Hello, and welcome back to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and in this episode, I spoke to Agathe Bounfour, head of the oil and gas programme at Campaign Group Transport and Environment. You may remember that Agathe has already been a guest on our show. She's now back to talk to us about a new investigation into the Italian oil major Eni and their biofuel crop production projects in Kenya and the Republic of the Congo.
What we found is a huge discrepancy between basically what Eni is saying to the general public and its investors and the results on the ground. It hasn't even passed beyond pilot stage, and this is true several years after the start of this new project.
I began by asking Agathe to explain what Eni's African biofuel plans were and why they were so significant.
Eni's strategy is about developing a whole new supply chain based on African agriculture crops in order to export vegetable oils to its refineries in Italy to produce green fuels for the aviation market. And what really drew our attention is first the ambition of this new program. The targets are quite huge. So the company aims to produce about 700,000 tons of those crops by 2026, 2027, which represent about a quarter of its biorefining capacity. So it's a huge thing. They're also promoting social development in Africa by involving hundreds of thousands of small-scale African farmers. So from a kind of development point of view, the ambition and the social claims around the project were quite huge. And really it was also interesting to look more broadly in the political context around this project, which is that the Italian government and increasingly Europe is looking at setting up new energy partnerships in African countries. And that's definitely the case for Eni, both within the context of the start of the Ukraine war, where, several European countries, especially Italy, have looked at shifting some of their fossil fuel supplies. And really, we see an increase of this narrative of the need for Europe and Italy to set up those new energy partnerships to secure new supplies. And that's true both for fossil fuel projects and also for renewable sources. Eni is one of the oil company which has the most aggressive fossil fuel expansion strategy in Africa. Is the second oil company which spends the most investment in new oil and gas extraction, and at the same time promoting this new renewable energy project. So we're also looking at the potential interaction between what they're doing in those countries and those projects and how that really fits within their strategy, basically.
And your findings were?
And our findings. So basically, we looked at whether the results on the ground in two of the most advanced countries when it comes to this biofuel production, so namely Kenya and the Republic of Congo, whether the results on the ground met the ambition and the claims, social environmental claims around the project. And what we found is a huge discrepancy between basically what Eni is saying to the general public and its investors and the results on the ground. The main kind of result is that the company is significantly underproducing in comparison to its production targets. So, for instance, we've looked at Eni's production target in Kenya for 2020 to 2023, and we found out that the company has met only about 24% of its production target. In Congo, the Republic of Congo, it hasn't even passed beyond pilot stage, and this is true several years after the start of this new project. There are several reasons for this apparent failure. First one, we found by doing a lot of on-the-ground interview with farmers, cooperative stakeholders involved in the project, is that the yields of the crop are not good. And that's true both in Kenya, where those yields haven't met the farmers' expectations on the ground, but that's also true in Congo, where they have grown those crops on a larger scale. This is growing castor, which is a plant that is grown in Africa, usually for the pharmaceutical cosmetic sector, but now is being used and pushed by Eni as a new crop for biofuel production. And the promise was that it would grow on arid land in rural area, and that, it wouldn't need irrigation, and it would be kind of a substitute to growing food crops on, large amount of land, monoculture production, etc. So the promise was really that they would solve some of the current issues that are linked to biofuel production, mainly the competition between the food and the energy sector, and also wouldn't deprive African farmers from their water resources, and of course will be grown also environmentally from a pesticide use point of view, for instance. So yeah, it is they're betting on castor production. The yields for now haven't proved good. The production has also been, especially in Kenya, severely affected by drought. So the claim that this plant is drought resistant hasn't been made by actual evidence from what we found on the ground. And what's quite interesting is that also it looks like their small farming business model isn't also working very well, mainly because farmers have told us that the price that is offered for this production is really low in comparison to their other crops. Also, some farmers had difficulties intercropping this castor plant, notably the taller variety of that plant with their traditional crops, which are beans, mangoes, cowpeas. It really depends on the area. And they also had a lot of issues with production aggregation and providing sufficient support to the farmers. So it's also showing that, the main cover for this project, which is small-scale farming, is not really looking great on the ground. And there are probably also issues related to the scale-up of the project. And that's definitely the case in Congo, Brazzaville.
And what have been the approaches of the Congolese government or the various governments involved to these projects?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's pretty clear from the fieldwork is that there's really little supervision from a public policy point of view of those projects. So basically the government, whether it's the national government or the local counties, we've done several interviews with local county government in Kenya, really trust any to develop those projects. There's really little supervision, little transparency around the numbers of farmers involved, the production numbers. It's been also hard for us to research this because there's not so much follow-up. So I think it tells you quite a lot about the expectation from, those companies coming in those countries or, developing green project on top of their existing fossil fuel business. That's the case in Congo, Brazzaville, for instance, and how there's little accountability and supervision basically of those projects. The government are also facilitating the development of the project on the ground. So for instance, we found that in one of the local counties in Kenya, the Makueni County has leased a large chunk of their land for the construction of Eni's agri-hub facility, which, produces the oil. In Congo, it's hard to know because the details of the partnership are confidential. So we don't really know necessarily the financial, arrangement or support that might be provided by the national government. But what we do know is that more globally, the Congolese government has provided and enacted legislation in order to grant huge area of lands to the aggregate business companies that Eni's partnering up with. So it's not a direct, handover to Eni, but it's true that the government, the Congolese government, is easing and providing regulation to facilitate the activities of those huge agribusiness companies on the ground with social and environmental issues linked to those projects. So, for instance, one of the agribusiness company working with Eni, Agri-Resources, has been associated with alleged cases of land expropriation and crop destruction in one of the areas where Eni is developing their project on one of their farms. So it also tells you quite a lot about the really difficult context and the supply chain risk linked to those projects while Eni is operating in Congo, Brazzaville.
And what do you think it says about Eni and Eni's operations and their confidence in sustainable aviation fuels?
It's hard to answer that question because, we've put those questions to them, but it's hard to read between the lines of the official communication, right? But I think from our experience researching the strategy of oil companies, there are two main hypotheses. The main one is that they're trying to diversify increasingly their energy supplies, notably because they've pledged to phase out or the use of the most damaging biofuel crops, namely palm oil, and they're a bit desperate to secure new volumes for their refineries. Second thing is they're increasingly, as many companies, betting on climate solution, technological solution that fits within their existing business model. So, biofuels is blended within mostly fossil fuel-based fuels. And so they're also pushing that solution, as a way to continue their existing business. That's pretty clear. Also, a main hypothesis, we haven't really found proper evidence, but it's clear from their communication strategy that they have to develop so-called green project whenever they open new fossil fuel production in some countries. So as I said in the intro, Eni is incredibly investing new money into oil and gas production in some of the key countries where they're developing the biofuel project. That's true in the Republic of Congo, where they're developing a new LNG project. That's also true in other countries such as Ivory Coast, Angola, and more widely, they have like this really aggressive fossil fuel expansion strategy in Africa. So the interaction between the green projects and the fossil fuel project are definitely interesting, and I think worth continuing exploring. But they usually announce those partnerships at the same time and as part of the same deals with the national government. Yeah.
And then talking a little bit about the impacts on the kind of the local communities, and maybe you could say something more about those impacts and maybe something about the alternatives. I mean, I think you've gone into it a little bit, that some of the main alternatives were essentially food crops. And to what extent are these projects dislodging positive projects on food production, etc.?
Yeah, so on the competition with food, there's no strong evidence that for now in Kenya, those projects are in competition with, large food production, mainly because some farmers have really small scale land area they're exploiting, and also because they've tried intercropping with the traditional food crop, as I've said.
And to be clear for our listeners, intercropping, if you could explain that term.
It's about producing several varieties of different plants on the same land and building on the different time for those crop production. So it's basically using the same land area to produce several type of plants or crops. And so most farmers have tried growing both the new castor feedstock and their traditional crops, such as bean, mangoes, maize, etc. Some have been successful, some have failed, because one testimony, for instance, several testimonies show that the taller variety of the castor takes a lot of sun and prevent them from growing, the beans. So some have actually given up and prioritized castor, but some have totally, quit the castor program too. So yeah, there's no strong evidence for now, but the risks are still there, because if you give up small scale farming and you start producing castor crops on a really large amounts of lands to meet the production target, then those grids are going to materialize at some point. So that's really important. But I think the impact on the local communities also has more to do about what I've said about the premises for the extra revenue, so-called new cash crops that, farmers could grow with really little supervision, real little support. So basically they're given the seeds for free, and then it's up for them to grow that crop. And then if they fail to grow that crop, basically they're taking up the risk. There's a guarantee that, the aggregator company working with Eni would buy the production if they're successful. But if they're not successful, then there's no guarantee, whatsoever that they fail the project, they don't get any revenue. So I think those premises of, a magical kind of castor cash crop are not met on the ground, and some of the farmers are really disappointed. That's for Kenya. For Congo, it's a bit more difficult because it's not small-scale farming. It's mostly big companies doing agriculture there. The case of, land expropriation and crop destruction are really worrying, but they're not necessarily linked to any new project. Those are linked to the land insecurity context in Congo, Brazzaville, which is really high, and linked to the fact that, agricultural production by those big agribusiness companies is really risky. And I think the lesson from this point of view is that Eni hasn't necessarily done their due diligence and looked properly at, what would be the actual outcomes for the population. So there's, again, a lot of discrepancy between what they promise the project would bring in terms of development and what we have found so far, yeah.
And part of your job is looking at oil companies in the oil industry anyway. How surprised are you by your own findings on that? And actually, to what extent, where you would like them to be on this, ideally?
You're always a bit surprised with the result of your own finding. You have your own hypothesis when you start a project. I wasn't necessarily trusting Eni to develop such a project at that scale on the ground. I had my open question about this. But then I think what I found the most interesting from the research is the level of disorganization on the ground, the different stakeholders involved, the fact there's really little supervision. That's something that I found the most perhaps surprising and interesting, because the company, they communicate so much about this project. And usually when they try to do something, they're also careful about, the potential reputational risk associated with those projects. So I think I found quite interesting the fact that they don't seem to bother so much, I guess. Then, given the previous failures of biofuels projects before in several different areas of the world, we knew from the start there was high risk associated with these projects and the premises for sure. But then I guess I wouldn't have expected any to underperform that much. I think that's something that was quite interesting from the ground results. Yeah. I mean, in terms of alternative, it's a really good question. For now, there's no perfect solution to decarbonizing the so-called hard-to-abate transport sector, such as aviation and shipping. That's clear. I think those type of projects are also a way to prevent regulators for implementing harder policies. I mean, harder from a kind of social, let's say societal point of view, meaning implementing energy sobriety measures. That's really clear. And there's also always this belief that, you go abroad and secure those new extra energy resources, and that would be a solution for Europe's energy supplies issues. And I think these kind of beliefs and frameworks need to be questioned for sure. I guess that's the main kind of outcome from a kind of more, from a solution point of view.
I mean, we've done quite a few podcasts on biofuels themselves. I mean, are you of the view then that they probably shouldn't be investing in biofuel research itself, given that, it produces emissions, etc., and that you're not really necessarily going to get a good climate outcome?
I don't think it's a yes or no answer. I think the problem is, again, the scale of the ambition and also what type of feedstock and promises they're advertising. We know there might be so-called sustainable biofuels that have a less detrimental climate and biodiversity impacts, mainly the ones that are not, again, linked to food crop production or linked to deforestation in Asia and Africa. But the problem is the volumes of those biofuels are not there, and not there at the scale they're advertising for. That's the main issue. So I don't think the point is to say that we shouldn't use any biofuels whatsoever. There's a small percentage that is, being notably supported by EU regulation to integrate within the fuels. But whether that could be the only climate solution and the scale of the promises, I think is questionable, yeah.
Thanks very much to Agathe Bounfour for her time. You can find the link to the full Transport and Environment investigation and its report on our podcast blurb. Please do follow our podcast if you enjoy listening to it, and Bertie will be back in a fortnight to discuss food monopolies. Thanks for listening.